Thank you for joining me again. This is episode 49 of the Political Mike podcast, and I want to extend a warm welcome to those who you may have thought that Political Mike was off the air. I assure you, we're still going strong, almost 50 episodes. Thank you for tuning in faithfully. And we have so much to talk about. We're talking about Virginia and New Jersey having a very interesting, each of them having their own very interesting gubernatorial races, with Virginia's race very close, neck and neck. We're also talking about major pieces of the Biden proposal, the Build Back Better agenda, being stripped as negotiations are coming to an end. Today, there were announcements that key provisions that a lot of progressive Democrats had banked on will no longer be in the proposal. And the question remains, will the progressives settle for that kind of compromise? And then there's the national uproar about critical race theory and how it's also having an effect on our elections and whether or not it'll have an effect on our midterm elections in just a few months. And the revelations about what happened leading up to January 6th, specifically in the Willard Hotel. We have two other professors joining tonight, but I'm so glad to have Professor Fred Cook on the show once again. Professor Cook, of course, is an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Law, an alum of Howard University School of Law, a member of the DC Bar, and is very distinguished and very diverse accomplishments. So, Professor Cook, thank you for being back.
So, okay, yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here and try to contribute as much as I can. I'm not sure how much I can, but I'll give it a shot.
So, Professor, today, the whole situation about critical race theory is interesting. We're seeing that on this issue, conservatives and liberals share diametrically opposing viewpoints on the subject of critical race theory. Glenn Youngkin, the Republican candidate for governor, has adopted a stance that's popular with Republicans, and that he would ban it from being taught in Virginia public schools if he is elected. Many of its detractors see it as a stand-in for liberal wokeness and decry it teaches particularly young children to hate their country. Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was on The View last week, and she voiced her opinion that we should not make students feel bad about themselves. I want to get your thoughts on your thoughts on the debate of critical race theory, and whether you think it's going to have an impact on the gubernatorial elections and going forward into the 2022 midterms.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a false debate because it is set up as though critical race theory has been taught, has been advocated, has been foisted upon public school children in grades K through 12, and that's just untrue. Critical race theory is a series of approaches, of analytic approaches to race relations that are typically taught at college, but more often at a graduate school level. So have there been teachers in public school who have talked about the effects of race and racism in America? Absolutely. But that's much, much different than critical race theory. And most of the people who rail against critical race theory don't really understand what it is and what it is not. What they do understand, I think, is that whenever white people in America are forced to confront the historic racism of this country, they recoil. They do not feel comfortable talking about this topic. And I believe that you cannot solve a problem if you don't talk about the problem. Running from it will not save you from it. You have to confront the problem. And too many cases, the great majority of white people don't want to confront the history of racism in America. And unfortunately, it turns into a kind of a mushy discussion of, well, you want white people to feel bad about what we didn't do. This was done by people 100 years ago or 300 years ago. And why do you want us to feel bad about that? And quite frankly, if you really understood critical race theory, the idea is we don't want you to feel bad. If you feel bad, that's a choice you make. What we want you to do is to understand the context in which so many things in America have happened and how the history of racism, the history of slavery, the history of segregation has contributed to where we are now. And if you understand that, maybe we can begin to undo some of that. But I don't think white people are evil. I think white people who do bad things are evil, but white people are not evil. So there's a difference, and too often that just doesn't get discussed that way.
Yeah, and USA Today actually indicated that more than 60% of Americans believe that the effects of slavery should be taught in schools. This is something that you just can't avoid. And what was interesting was that Secretary Condoleezza Rice had mentioned, look, she's fine with slavery being taught, but we shouldn't get into all of the aftermath of what happened. You're talking about the reasons why there is an income gap in this country, the reason why there is a graduation gap in this country, a wealth gap. Professor McDougall, thank you for joining us tonight. This is my first time having you on this program, so it's an honor. Professor McDougall also is a professor at Howard University School of Law. He's also a contributor to the Huffington Post, and it's my honor to have him. I've had him in Perspectives of Civil Rights Planning, one of my favorite courses at Howard Law. And, Professor, I'm interested to get your take on, the impact that critical race theory will have on the gubernatorial elections next week, and possibly into the 2022 midterms coming up.
Can you hear me, Michael? Okay, good. I'm sorry, I don't know your guest.
Fred Cook, adjunct faculty member at the Howard University School of Law.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I guess critical race theory, the way you've posed the question, critical race theory is not what's being taught in the schools. Critical race theory is taught in some law schools and some graduate schools. I think by critical race theory, the folks who are opposing it mean any kind of examination of the role that slavery and racism has played in the history of this country. And I actually heard something on PBS this morning. Obviously there's a lot of parents who are trying to run for school boards right now all over the country, kind of energized by this because they think that their children are going to be taught that white people have been unkind to Black people, and they don't want that to be what they learn in school. Again, the notion that this is critical race theory is just, something that I think that people who are promoting this made up, because it's not critical race theory. It's a question of whether or not people who learn the history of this country should learn the true history, the complete history. I know I didn't learn it when I was in elementary school. It was until college that I got it. But I think, young people are smarter and better informed these days. And I think, actually, my understanding is that it's the young people that are really pushing this. High school kids have done some amazing things in the last couple of years. The whole kind of gun control thing that came out of Parkland. You have the young lady from Sweden. I'm just blanking on her name right now. The environmentalist Greta Thunberg. High school kids are very, very serious about wanting the world that they live in and they grow up in and their children grow up in to be balanced, both in terms of climate and in terms of social justice. So I think that people who are trying to protect young people from the truth are not really listening to young people about this.
And I'm curious. Thank you, Professor. I'm curious as to whether or not Democrats are going to get some are going to get some flack in the polls, basically based on the fact that you're seeing images, weekly of parents frustrated in these school board meetings, specifically, I believe in the Fairfax, Virginia area, where a lot of people have been also opposed to bathroom bills that would allow transgenders to use bathrooms based on their identified gender. And I'm wondering if these culture wars, President Obama on the stump for Terry McAuliffe called it, phony, trumped up culture wars that are fabricated basically to sow fear and division for political gain. And I'm wondering if in the long run, you guys think this would be beneficial to the GOP. We're seeing a very close race with Youngkin and McAuliffe. And a lot of people, have articulated that Terry McAuliffe said that he's opposed to parents being involved in their education, even though McAuliffe has said in the debates and on the stump that that's not what he said. And before I continue, let me just express the views shared by myself and the gentleman here are our own. They're not the views of anyone else, and I want to make that clear. But I want to also ask for your perspective, professors. If anyone can jump in.
Sure. Well, I think that the Republicans, the people who call themselves Republicans right now, at least, are going to certainly try to make hay and to try to derive some political benefit from this critical race theory discussion. It is a non-discussion in the sense that it is totally made up and non-serious about what the issue really is. But it never stops political debate from moving forward, because so much of the public may be uninformed about an issue, and they take their cues from the tribe they most closely identify with, and so that becomes fact, irrespective of whether it is as objectively a fact or not. And so, I think they're going to make progress in it, because people are underinformed, misinformed, and anxiety ridden, and these things play into those anxieties. So sure, they're gonna get some advantage out of it, and that's unfortunate.
Well, I would agree with that. The thing that I actually have an article that's kind of come out in about a month from the University of San Diego Law Review, which is called "Think Nationally, Act Locally." Think globally, act locally. The thing is that when you say that Obama has come in to stump, for McAuliffe in Virginia, the problem is not the problem really does not originate at that level. The problem is at the school board level. And I think one of the things that I'm talking about in the article is that progressive people and liberals for a very long time have behaved as if the national level is the only place at which politics is actually going on. It's going on at the state level and the local level, and the Republicans, the conservatives, or however you want to put it, they're very much aware of this, and they've been building power at the local level, school boards, county councils, state legislatures. 3/4 of the state legislatures are now in the hands of Republicans. It's at the state legislature level that voting restrictions are put in place, stand your ground laws, voter ID, all of that stuff. That's all being done at the local level. I think that one of the mistakes that the Democratic Party made, it really goes back to like the 1980s, after Reagan was elected. There was a guy, I forget his name, out of the University of Wisconsin, who wrote a book called Right Turn. Basically, the Democratic Party, the whole Democratic Leadership Conference conference that Clinton comes out of and a bunch of others come out of, they had this triangulate idea, right? I mean, basically what they were trying to do is that they thought that they could have a better shot at the presidency if they could raise more money from corporations. They kind of left the working people and the minority people kind of on the side, like, what are they going to do? Vote Republican? They're not going to vote Republican. We can count on them. So let's move our whole agenda slightly to the right, towards, kind of the center. That's a triangulation thing. And we'll be able to raise money, from corporations and people who more identify with the middle and maybe even a little bit to the right. And the minorities and the working people will have no choice but to vote for us. So we don't really have to throw them, too many bones. The problem with that theory is that, they're not going to vote Republican. They're not going to vote at all. And so what happens is you have lower and lower turnouts among the populations that support the Democratic Party while they're moving themselves to the right. So I think that, when you say the Democrats going to have trouble, given with these images, well, they are, as long as they organize their playbook the way that they have. We're going to go at the national level. We're going to duke it out, on C-SPAN or, I'm blanking on it, the national media. You're going to duke it out of the national media. You really need to be organizing on the ground level. And that's really where you earn people's trust. I mean, I think even the folks who are worried about critical race theory, if you had some serious Democratic organizers who knew how to talk to people, kind of going into those areas, maybe running some candidates for school board themselves, going out into neighborhoods and talking to people like the Democrats used to do. They don't do it anymore. They come and see you 2 weeks before it's time to vote. So they really have to repair a lot of their roots They have to go back to their roots, and they have to deal with people in terms of their everyday situations, their everyday lives. If they really want to win this, that's my thought.
Yeah, and one of the most, I think, amazing developments with this whole election in Virginia is just the fine line that Youngkin was kind of walking, not embracing Trump 100%, but actually not distancing himself from Trump enough to win the Trump base and the traditional conservative base. And when you look at the fact that Biden won the state of Virginia last November at 54.4% of the vote to Trump's
10-point lead.
Yeah,
10
points, because Trump was at 44%. And you're looking at Fairfax County, you're looking at Loudoun County, you're looking at Prince William County. You're just seeing those are the blue areas. But of course, when you go more west in Virginia and you get into places like Warren County, Page County, Shenandoah County, that's Trump country. I'm wondering if the distancing from Trump, and then the whole issue, even the Lincoln Project teasing Trump saying, Glenn Youngkin doesn't want you here, and trying to get under his skin in that way. I'm wondering if that's going to actually prove beneficial to Democrats if Trump does not come. Is the Trump base going to be disturbed if, Glenn Youngkin is distancing himself enough from Trump to try to make it look like he's running against the Trump agenda, being that Trump is very much a dominant political force in that side of the aisle?
I'm going to turn it over to Fred. I just have to close the door here. There's a little bit of noise.
Sure. No, I think so. I think what Trump did in 2020 was animate the Democrat Party electorate. And that's what McAuliffe and his people are trying to do by making Trump a focal point of the election for Mr. Youngkin, is to animate the Democratic base. What seems not to have happened so far, and much because of what Professor McDougall said, because the Democrat Party playbook is not designed to work from the ground up. It doesn't animate people around a coherent set of principles, beliefs, ideals that people can stay plugged into and rely on. They continually turn the elections into cult of personality. If I really, really like you, I'll go vote for you. But it's got nothing to do with any kind of real agenda that works for poor people, working class people, anything like that. It's got to do with, I really like Michelle Obama. She looks so nice. I really like Barack Obama. He's so articulate. Bill Clinton looks like somebody I'd like to have a beer with. Well, that's a lot of horse hockey, but that's what it turns into. And so when 44% of the people in Virginia voted for Donald John Trump, okay, that's troubling because he is such a jackass. But 44% of the vote voted for him. What defeated him was he was such a jackass that 11% more of the rest of the people, than the majority of the other half of the people, voted against him. And you can't win elections for long terms voting against people. You have to vote for people. And Trump was such a catalytic force for voting against that he made it possible. What Terry McAuliffe and the Democrats in Virginia did not do was make Terry McAuliffe exciting enough for people wanting to vote for him. And what he's been trying to do now is to make people vote against Donald Trump with Glenn Youngkin's face on it. And maybe that'll work, but it shouldn't be close. It should not be close. Glenn Youngkin should not be a serious candidate for governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, but he is.
I mean, you might say that Donald Trump wasn't a serious candidate for the presidency of the United States. I mean, Trump himself didn't think he was going to get elected.
Yeah.
So it's a mess.
It's a horrible mess.
It's a mess. It's a mess. I mean, and it's, like I say, I think the only way to fix this is to go back to the grassroots and start building your way back up. It's the only thing that you can do. I mean, you can keep doing this stuff, like what, Professor Cook was just talking about in terms of, scarecrows on this side, scarecrows on that side. I mean, the problem is, I think that kind of amplified what he was saying, is that when you run politics like that, because Republicans are, doing the same thing, the difference with the Republicans is that they have a strategic advantage in terms of the levers of power. They got a majority in the Supreme Court. They've got, like I say, 3/4 of the state legislatures where all of the voting rules are taking place. They're running legislation through right now that will enable these state legislatures to nullify, the outcome of the elections in their states. To send alternate electors in there. All that's the machinery. They're really very sophisticated about the machinery. So that's very troubling. But, in terms of the message is as shallow on the Republican side as and Professor Cook is mentioning on the Democrat. It's as shallow on both sides. That's the problem. If you can fire people up with notions that are that shallow, like critical race theory is coming for your children, or immigrants are at the border, or Trump's going to get you. I mean, if you can fire people up from a long distance with media and stuff like that, the whole political roots and political culture of the country has become very shallow. That's very dangerous, very dangerous.
Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of folks have said is that even with the Democratic side in Virginia, Terry McAuliffe has a lot going against him, with the negotiations seeming to be going on without an end, and a lot of people, I guess, losing patience with the Biden administration, which probably is reflective in dropping poll numbers. But I'm wondering if McAuliffe, the kind of the reverse, like if McAuliffe is running from Biden, in almost the same way as Glenn Youngkin seems to be running from Trump, in that he's he's saying they need to get in a room and come to negotiation and come on out, and kind of trying to say, Washington needs to get their act together, distancing himself from his party and his colleagues on the Hill. I'm wondering if that's actually a smart move, or if it's unnecessary.
Fred?
I don't know. I think it's necessary. I think the congressional Democrats have done such a horrible job of moving an agenda forward that can be accomplished, that you have to sort of say, I'm not part of that mess, because I think it frustrates people. It frustrates people who were forward thinking and thought that the election of Joe Biden would sweep in an agenda that would benefit things they cared about. Now, they were wrong about that, because that's part of the hustle. But it is extremely frustrating when you see these Democrat leaders in the Congress say these crazy things like, we're going to have a $6 trillion program. Well, there is no way in God's green earth that was ever going to happen. There isn't that much agreement amongst Democrats, let alone the so-called Republicans, to get a $6 trillion program. But then they talked about 3 trillion, 375 trillion, or whatever. But they never talked about what they were going to do substantively. They kept talking about the number and not what this is going to do to make a difference in your life. How is this really going to be different for you? And how are they really going to sell it to their colleagues? Because some of the Democrats are in districts that are absolutely safe. They couldn't lose if they tried. Other districts, it's much more dicey, and you've got to figure out a way to play more toward people who don't share a progressive agenda as much as you might. And they didn't give those members of Congress cover. When they talk about Roosevelt had incredible majorities in the House and the Senate. He could do whatever the hell he wanted to do. But when you don't have those kinds of working majorities, you can't be extreme, because you're talking about people sacrificing their political careers for what you think is a good idea. And most politicians don't have that kind of courage. They're not going to sacrifice their political career for a good idea. They'd rather be elected and work on a half good idea than be unelected after having promoted a good idea.
Hey, go ahead, Professor.
I would say two things about that. One is that, again, I raised my question about, why is what Biden is doing, and what Trump is doing, why is what Biden is doing, what Trump is doing, why is that, how is that, why should that determine what happens in an election in Virginia? I mean, what is McAuliffe going to do for people in Virginia? He's going to say, hey, Biden, send me some of that money. Well, what are you doing in Virginia? Same thing with Youngkin, whatever his name is. What are you going to do in Virginia? In Virginia, you're going to keep people, you're going to keep critical race theory from getting your kids. I mean, that's what you're going to do for people in Virginia. I mean, again, it's this whole thing about everything is federal, everything is national, and that, which means it's very, very far away. It's very, very easy to misrepresent what's actually going on far, far away. What's happening down the block from you. What's happening with your mayor, what's happening with your county council, what's happening with your state representative. What are they doing? They have some power. What's your state court doing? They have some power. And again, I'm not talking about, going back to, just the states are all independent and all that kind of stuff. I mean, we have a federal government for a reason, but I just think that the balance between what's happening federally on the state level and on the local level is going all kind of crazy. One other thing too about what Professor Cook was saying about these guys in safe districts and the ones who are not in such safe districts. I think it's really too bad that we have a situation where the primary thing that a politician thinks about is getting reelected. I mean, I know what this is. I mean, I spent like a year on sabbatical from a law school that I was teaching at before to run the NAACP's legislative program. I was the Washington bureau chief for the NAACP just for a year, just kind of see what's going on. And I remember, I've always been a person who's interested in the grassroots and things like that. So I remember going into a House Judiciary Committee meeting, and I went to Yale Law School, and one of my classmates from Yale was the legislative director for the Judiciary Committee. And, I was called in to testify about some bill or another. And he said to me he kind of pulled me aside after the hearing. He said, Harold, there's a problem I need to talk to you about. I said, what's going on? He said, every time there's a civil rights bill that comes before the House, we see the same 4 or 5 guys in suits. He said, when the Americans with Disabilities Act was up in front of us, the Capitol was covered with people in wheelchairs. I mean, it's like, again, we have this idea that a few of us can make decisions for a lot of us. And we're smarter than anybody else. We got elected, we're smarter than anybody else. I don't want to hear from my constituents. I'm going to figure this out all by myself. Your constituents call you, you don't answer the phone. Your staff maybe gets to you, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I'm going on. Good, Michael. Back over.
No, you're right on the money. And I know we talked a lot about Virginia, but even in New Jersey, you're starting to see Murphy's lead narrowing somewhat as the race has progressed, but only slightly from September. Mammoth poll showed Ciattarelli, just down by 13 points among likely voters, 53 to 40%. In August, Murphy led by 17 points. And of course, Biden also went on to stump for Murphy. And it was kind of like a, hit 2 birds with 1 stone kind of deal, because he was also touting what the Build Back Better, what the infrastructure plan would mean for the bridges in New Jersey, for the infrastructure in New Jersey. And, Jack Ciattarelli seems to be someone who can, I guess, win back that coalition that got Chris Christie in office. And I'm wondering, if, just, the fact that you, Professor, mentioned, nationalization of races seems to be, more and more a factor as we progress further and further along in history. And to me, nationalization of races always seems to benefit Republicans more. Whenever they bring out the big shots, look at Jamie Harrison. I mean, I know it was South Carolina, but you start to see how they were bringing out, a lot of celebrities on the inside. They were bringing out national political figures to South Carolina, and still he fell short in his race, his bid for Senate. I'm wondering if the same would happen in New Jersey. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, look, New Jersey, historically hasn't elected a Democrat governor consecutively in 40 years. That's an odd thing to happen, but it seems to have happened. But again, I think that Professor McDougall makes a point, that he's made a couple of times here that I think is really, really quite important, and it goes back to, the days of the formation of the civil rights movement with Charles Hamilton Houston. The reliance on the federal government and the federal judiciary to save us from all the horrors on the planet, and this sort of mentality that has grown up and become almost institutionalized in too many of us, that the solution is always at the federal level. The Supreme Court will stop the craziness. The circuit courts of appeal will stop the craziness. The president, the Congress will stop the craziness. And that's caused too many of us to abandon the idea that we have the ability at the local level to control our lives. Republicans figured it out because they had to. When I say Republicans, conservatives, reactionaries, whatever you want to call them, when they were getting beat across the head in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s by the Supreme Court, they said, this is some bullshit. We can't let this keep going on. And they decided we will take control of what we can. And whether that's the state house, the state legislature, the county council, the city council, that's what they focused on. And they've been on a 40-year, 50-year war to get that control. And so-called Democrats, liberals have all said, we don't need to worry about 456 races. We just need to win the presidency and control the Supreme Court, and life will be sweet. Well, what happens when you don't do that? Then you're screwed. And that's kind of where we are collectively, mentality-wise, is that there's way too much reliance on that. And as you know, Mr. Taylor, I teach a course in local government at the law school, and talking about municipal affairs, local government, what powers it has, how you as a citizen can make your life very different almost immediately at the local level in a way you cannot at the federal or state level. And it's just too many people don't focus on that. And I think Professor McDougall hit on a very important thing about mindset. It's just not there, and that's going to create problems.
Now,
I'm sorry, but the added dividends, to what Professor Cook is talking about is that you build power at the local level, and all of a sudden you run into national.
Right.
The whole Hamilton, Charles Hamilton Houston thing. As soon as that happened, conservatives in this country were saying, we got to do something about the Supreme Court. Eisenhower said that appointing, Earl Warren was the biggest mistake he ever made in his life.
That's right.
Nixon with his Nixon invents the Southern strategy.
Right.
And basically he, in the 1968 election, he looks at the polls, he sees that he gets roughly, 45, 46% of the vote. Humphrey gets a little bit less. And, what's his name out of Alabama, Wallace, gets 14% of the vote as an independent candidate. 14% of the vote, the biggest percentage of any independent candidate since Teddy Roosevelt. And when Teddy Roosevelt ran, he had already been president once. So Nixon says, okay, all I got to do is add that 14% to our Republican 44%. We got to lock on the White House. For the next 40 years, from 1968 to 2008, right, there's 10 presidencies, 7 of them are Republican, only 3 are Democrat. That's how you get in there. That's how you get the Supreme Court to look like it looks now.
Yeah.
So again, kind of emphasizing what Professor Cook is saying is that, you build power at the local level, but guess what? This is a federal system. If you build power at the local level, you're going to wind up with power at the national level as well. So now they have it going both ways.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, excellent points. And it's interesting because, there was a political article that showed that Biden is actually, making history quietly with his appointments. It says overall, Biden is outpacing every other president since Richard Nixon in confirming circuit court judges, who have the last word in federal courts. So there's some hope for Democrats on that front. Of course, this is very early in the administration. We're still in the first year of the Biden presidency, and who knows what the next 3 years have. And I know he's committed himself to appointing a black female Supreme Court justice if that opportunity presents itself. But back to New Jersey real quick. Why does Jack Ciattarelli seem to have an advantage over Phil Murphy when it comes down to the economy? He's famously going around the state saying, look, if taxes are your number one issue, then New Jersey's not your state. And you're looking at, actually 20% of the New Jersey electorate saying that taxes are their number one issue. 16% saying school and education, 15% for the pandemic. So why is that the case in your view?
Phil, is the incumbent, and he's had to grapple with coronavirus. He's had to grapple with a bad economy, and it's easy to make him the boogeyman, the guy that screwed up your life. Everything was wonderful before the virus, and now it's not, and it's his fault. New Jersey is a kind of an odd state, an odd combination of progressive and conservative or reactionary people in the same vein. I've got two of my law partners are from New Jersey, and they like to say that the most prevalent export from the state of New Jersey is young people, because they got to get out of there, because the old people are driving them crazy, because they're also conservative. They sort of, and that's sort of a part of the culture. They sort of like it. They think that's an identity thing for them, is to be contrarian and to be conservative and to get the government out of your life and to be kind of smart alecky like Chris Christie, to kind of be in your face and to call you crazy names like their brothers across the river in New York City. They think that's the way the world ought to work. And I think that Phil isn't that kind of in your face guy. He's not that advocate that they want to see. And I think that he suffers from that. Although I don't think he's done a bad job by any stretch of the imagination, but that's not the test.
The Jersey people have a reputation of being tough guys. Like you said, the brothers across the river there in New York. Are you looking at me?
Yeah,
that kind of stuff, right? I mean, that's very Jersey. That's very New York. So you really have to swagger a little bit.
Yeah, and Phil doesn't do that. I mean, he's a reasonable, rational human being, but that doesn't fit the New Jersey vibe for some people, for a lot of people, unfortunately.
So today, the White House triumphantly introduced a framework for the big social spending package that has taken months to negotiate. Biden delivered a White House speech. Cabinet members were dispatched to talk to lawmakers. Mayors were called to and blasted out their approval. Progressive groups unveiled new campaign ads, and talking points were distributed to key allies to amplify support for the president's Build Back Better agenda. But you do have a lot of anger, despite all of what seems to be optimism, because of what was gutted out of this plan. You're talking about the child tax credit that was removed out, paid family leave that was taken out, the shrinking size of the bill, from 3 trillion, now we're getting to 1.75 trillion. And, a lot of these representatives on the Hill don't want to give up their pet project. So I'm wondering, whether you think in making this pitch that Biden actually has a bill here. I know there was a moment in his speech where he said, I know we can come to an agreement, or I know we can come down to a plan. And then he said, no, we will come down to a plan. What say you, gentlemen?
I mean, the Democrats were fragmented coming into the administration. There were 11 or 12 people running. People got knocked off here and there and stuff like that. And then Clyburn came in and basically made it Biden's, take. But there just was not. I mean, as Professor Cook was saying, it was all anti-Trump essentially. We can beat Trump, but I think the subtext was we can use Trump as the boogeyman, the scarecrow, whatever. We can beat Trump, and basically we won't have to do much else. I think that Biden has articulated a lot of very kind of broad and progressive views. I think partly because the progressive wing of the Democratic Party this time around was so strong that he had to do that. But it was basically the Democratic establishment that won the right to represent the Democratic Party in the White House. And the establishment is, it's conflicted. They're conflicted about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But again, back to the whole point that I think that Professor Cook and I are still making. My primary contact, what my primary contact with the Democratic Party is emails that I get from Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Obama, asking for money.
That's right.
They don't ask me what I think. They don't ask me to come to a meeting and see people. They don't even ask me to come on a Zoom meeting and talk to folk. It's like, if you really think this is important, send us some money. It's like, you can't, there's some of this stuff that you just can't buy. And I think that their energetic fundraising, kind of, to me, it kind of disguises a real, what's the word? I want a word, atrophy. a kind of an atrophy, of organizing and outreach and connection with people. I mean, they're gonna have to get real. They're gonna have to be really part of people's lives if they wanna move any of this kind of stuff forward.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree with you more, Professor McDougall. As you can tell, I'm an old guy, relatively successful in my life, and that is fine. But friends who I have who are similarly situated, we have this conversation just that you had constantly. Why is it the only time I hear from these schmucks is when they want money from me? That's all they ever do is ask me for money. I'm on somebody's list who sold my name to somebody else's list, who sold it to somebody else's list, and I get this constant stream of emails asking for money. But nobody says to me, a guy who is, a little bit down the road, has had some experiences. What do you think about this? How can we work on that? Can you give us some ideas about how we ought to approach this? They never ask that. They never care about that. All they want is the money out of my pocket because they think that I've got it and I don't have a viable alternative to these so-called Republicans. And after you've been seeing this for a long time, it is extremely frustrating and quite frankly, it's annoying because you go like, dude, I have a brain. You can talk to me about something, can't you? But
Right.
they don't do that, and it's just so misguided, I think, and it just it's doomed to failure. It can't succeed.
They're in a rut. I mean, they're in a rut. I actually got an email from somebody. It might have been John Lewis. When he was still alive. Say, well, what do you think about this? And I answered one or two questions, and up it came. Was how am I making a $5 contribution? I mean, it's like, they couldn't even keep it up for more than one or two questions.
Yeah, it's and I just don't. I mean, I've worked on campaigns for people. Again, it's just a time on the planet thing. I've been able to do that for some time and know some of them from work life, fraternal life, whatever. And you just kind of go, I know you. Why don't you ever say anything to me other than have your chief of staff or a campaign person send me a request to get money? I mean, we know each other. How come we don't talk about something?
And all the messaging from the White House and Biden's speech was designed to portray the proposal in the Build Back Better agenda as an historic investment that can rival that of legislative accomplishments by Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson. I heard the comparison made with Lyndon Johnson, but the thing with Lyndon Johnson is that he was Senate Majority Leader before he became the vice presidential candidate for Jack Kennedy, and then was elected in 1960, and then after the assassination became president. And a lot of people said, Biden should have used the same strong arm tactics that Lyndon Johnson used, the Johnson treatment, getting in your face. Johnson standing, I think, at 6'4", towering over a lot of these folks. When you're looking at pictures of him hovering over Humphrey and a lot of these senators, Russell from Georgia, a lot of these people, he came in close in physical contact with, and even there were records of him calling folks' houses and their kids answering and him saying, well, get your dad on the phone or tell him this and tell him I said this, tell him your president said this. Should Biden have been a little bit more aggressive? I know he said this is what I ran on, this is what I campaigned on, and that none of us are 100% happy with the proposal. But do you think he should have been more aggressive in the way he was dealing with Joe Manchin? A lot of people said, this is not democracy to have a senator just from one state, West Virginia, dictate all of the concessions that take place in the bill. Not to mention Sinema, who was just basically AWOL in terms of where she stood and not revealing what her priorities were. Do you think Biden should have been more aggressive?
Yeah, he's not built like that. Look, Lyndon Johnson was absolutely ruthless. Absolutely ruthless. He would tear your heart out. He would make your life hell if you did not do what he wanted you to do. And it's a different Senate. I mean, he than it was then. And Joe Biden, I believe, I don't know him personally, so it's a belief, he truly reveres the Senate. He thinks of it as an institution that is inviolate. I think he's one of those senators who believes that being a senator is the best thing you could be. It's better than being president because you have a lot of power, but not all the responsibility. And I think he thinks that the Senate is almost this holy place, and he doesn't want to ruffle feathers. He wants to talk and work it out. And the fact is, the Senate's not what it was when Lyndon Johnson was president, but it's not the Senate that Joe Biden came into as a 30-year-old senator in the United States Senate. And there's a different group of people, a different mentality, and there is no, many of those guys don't have the same reverence for the institution that he does. They don't see the institution as being something that needs to be preserved, and so everybody has to give to get, and we have to sort of make this thing work because we have a constitutional responsibility. They believe, I'm a United States senator, I got a hammer, I'm going to use it, and if you don't like it, too bad, because the people back home elected me, you didn't. And I think it's just a different place, and I don't think he has the ability or the inclination to strong arm other senators. I just don't think he's built that way.
I think that Mitch McConnell is the poster child for what Professor Cook just said. I mean, completely manipulative. I mean, it's the whole, again, it's not the Senate that Biden, came in on. But, also don't forget, like FDR, when you talk about FDR, I mean, FDR wasn't a Lyndon Johnson, but he had a very, very strong left wing in the country pushing him all of the time. He had A. Philip Randolph on his ass, and he said to Randolph, he said, if you want me to get stuff done, you have to push me. You have to I think that's exactly what he said, make me do it. Because they had a conference, and I heard there was a record of it. He said, make me do it. So I think, when you talk about Biden, whatever you want Biden to do, he is your president. You got to make him do it. Make him do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, A. Philip Randolph famously said to Theodore Roosevelt, who tried to get him to ameliorate his position, help him.
Franklin Roosevelt.
I'm sorry, Franklin Roosevelt. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. He said, Mr. President, you misperceive our jobs. My job is not to make you look good. My job is to make you do stuff. Okay.
That's right.
That's right. And you have to have that. I think you have to have that tension. You have to have that other group trying to force the other group to behave differently, to do the things you want to get done. And this is just it's just a bad time in the country for compromise. It's a bad time to try to find common ground because people are so rigidly in their own positions, and they don't see the need to concede anything to the other side.
But you can't shy away from conflict in a situation like this. I mean, This is what the Democrats have been doing. They're like, let's play nice. Let's play nice. They go low, we go high. They while they're going low, they'll take your feet right out from under you.
Yeah. I mean, Mitch McConnell will eat their lunch. And I saw an article, not an article. I saw, I guess on MSNBC, Michael Steele sort of commenting about kind of inside baseball within the Republican Party. He says, look, the conversations among Republicans is, you don't need to worry about the Democrats. They're never going to do anything. We can do anything we want to do to them, and they're never going to do anything to us. So all they're going to do is talk. And I think there's a lot of truth to that in terms of the perception of so-called Democrats among so-called Republicans, is that they think there's no downside to yanking these guys around. They never make us pay.
Yeah, they have to. The Democrats have to respect their left wing a lot more than they do. The whole process, the whole kind of presidential, primary, all that stuff, that was, I was really disappointed in the way that all of that was handled. But one thing back to A. Philip Randolph, I think we want folks to understand, when A. Philip Randolph got in FDR's face, it wasn't just him. They were like, was it 10,000 men named George?
Yeah.
I mean, that Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. I mean, they got on trains and they were going all over the country. I mean, talk about an organizer's dream in terms of outreach. I mean, you don't have TV, you got radio, but you got these people personally. You got these sleeping car porters personally. Where not only the cities and the towns that they lived in, but they get on the train and they go hundreds of miles away. And they were all very, very active and progressive people. So, you need to, not only do you need an A. Philip Randolph, you need a Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, to kind of really make that message, bring that message to Biden so that he understands that this is going to make him look good. This is going to be good for the country, and it isn't just a matter of him, trying to convince the people on the other side of the aisle that this is a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm wondering, did did the progressive wing of the Democratic Party end up the biggest losers in these negotiations? Because you're talking about $400 billion. Everything was just shrunk down by a lot. It's still a lot of money, and it's still a monumental piece of legislation. But 400 billion for child care and preschool, for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, 150 billion for home care, 200 billion for the child tax and earned income tax credits. 555 for clean energy and climate investments. That was a big deal in this bill. And ACA credits, 130 billion. Even though these are, very monumental elements of the bill, did progressives end up the biggest losers in your view?
Probably. The question is, what hath this wrought kind of deal? Okay, so in a classic political negotiation, everybody gives a little to get a little, and we wind up in a place that there's sort of consensus around. But if one side or the other feels brutalized, and they've had to give up too much, so you get what you get now, but what do you get the next time around? What do you get down the road? How much resentment is there residually that's going to make the next discussion worse, or is going to cause a rebellion within the larger party of this group that feels brutalized, that the larger party suffers longer term damage? And I think that's the thing that Professor Madiga was talking about, is that the Democrats aren't paying enough attention to the left wing. These people don't feel as though they're getting a fair shake. They believe they're representing philosophic position, constituents, issues that are of importance, and they're not being heard. They're not being supported by the mainstream, Democrats. And at some point, they got to figure out what are we going to do about that? Because we cannot. I think so many of them, there's enough of them now that they can say, well, we just can't. This isn't a place for us. Maybe we need to either take over the Democratic Party in a more physical kind of controlling way, or start our own thing. Now that's got its own set of problems, and I'm not necessarily advocating it, but I think that there's a breaking point, a point of inelasticity when the so-called progressives feel like we aren't getting a fair shake out of this. We got you guys elected. You guys are now president because of what we did, and now when it comes time to rewarding us in the most base sense of politics, you don't want to reward us. You just want our votes, and now you want to dance with somebody else. That can't cut it for very long, I don't think.
Yeah. There's two things about that. One of them is this whole thing that the Democrats continue to be afraid of what the Republicans are going to say about them. So if they're too close with Omar or somebody, you're a communist, you're this, you're that. That's straight out of the the Republican, the conservative, to the right. That's straight out of their playbook. I mean, again, it's bullying. It's bullying and intimidation. Sometimes I think I wrote a Huffington Post piece where I compared the Democrats and the Republicans to the nerds and the bullies on a high school yard. I mean, the bullies they're gonna bully you as long as you until you come back at them. They're gonna keep at you, and the nerds keep thinking, well, look, if I just obey the rules and I do everything nice, they're gonna be nice to me. No, that's not how they construct it. Think about it again. Our folk up in New Jersey and up in New York. You looking at me. It's like they're like. So on the one hand, the Democrats are afraid that the Republicans are going to paint them as left wingers. That's the worst thing that's the worst thing that anybody could say about you. But that's not the worst thing that they could say about you for most of the American people. I mean, the things that the left wing is talking about is what everybody wants. It's what all the developed countries in Europe, they all have it. Paid family leave, all of that stuff. It's like, who are you kidding?
Yeah. Yeah. And the thing that makes it frustrating is that the Republicans are not going to choose Sinema over an actual Republican when she runs for re-election.
Right.
So it was like, what was the point? If you're not going to stick with the party that brought you to the dance, and you're only angering the base that even gave you a shot against McSally, and even for Manchin, if his whole argument is I'm the only Democrat that can get elected in West Virginia, well, maybe getting some monumental piece of legislation is bigger than your election chances, and maybe we can just invest in Florida with Val Demings, or replacing the senator who's retiring from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson,
Yeah.
getting somebody to get in that seat. What was the point of having a Democratic senator if they're not going to vote when monumental pieces of legislation come? And the thing on the flip side is, like, there's no Republican senator sitting right now that's there because they're the only Republican candidate that can win Democratic support from this state. So why are the Democrats always worried about, well, are the GOP going to be happy with us? And then at the end of it, the GOP is still not going to vote for the Build Back Better agenda. It's going to be on a party line vote. And the infrastructure deal was basically a miracle, to get folks to actually agree to it. But, you got to bring them some kind of bacon to your constituents for next year.
Yeah.
I
think that goes. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think that goes back again to what we were talking about before about the shallowness of the Democrats, political infrastructure. I mean, it's all up at the top. That's why they're so easily swayed one way or the other by the media. I mean, like there was a CNN interview with one of the progressive Congress people, and they were like, "Well, this is better than nothing, isn't it?" I mean, it's like, what are they, Republican or something? So again, it's the shallowness of the Republicans' roots. Their roots just don't go down very far, and so the Republicans say boo and they jump. I'm sorry, Frank. Go ahead.
No. I agree. I just think that there's a real lack of commitment to anything, and you're absolutely right. This idea that if you could somehow be called a leftist, a socialist, that is just a horrible indictment against you, and to some degree, it kind of creates a kind of lunacy among so-called conservative voters, that they see that as the worst thing you could be. It's again, I used to say to people that one of the things that I thought was really cool about America was that while there were Republicans and Democrats, they were different form of the same thing, and they really were about the same thing. They just had sort of different ways to get there, and so they really weren't enemies. They were just opponents. But that's really changed over the last 10, 15 years, and they really see each other almost as enemies. That if you are a Democrat, you are a horrible somebody who's not a child of God, and you have to be opposed at every turn. And that is very frightening, I think, for the longevity of the so-called American democratic experiment, because if people don't really believe in democracy, if they really don't believe in majoritarian rule, if they don't believe in the marketplace of ideas and the synthesis that the best idea comes out of that give and take, that I somehow have the right idea, and if you don't believe in my idea, you need to burn in hell. If people take that position, then this thing doesn't last very much longer.
I think democracy is on the table itself. I mean, there are people, particularly on the conservative side, who say they would rather win than have a democracy.
That's right. Yeah.
And the conservatives, they know how to win. I mean, look at the 2017 Jobs and Tax Cut Act. Not one of them bucked the party and said, well, this is the concessions I want to need from you before we move forward. They all moved in lockstep. But in the last minute of the show, I want to ask, what you all think about, the House voting to hold Steve Bannon in contempt, and the likelihood that the Justice Department under Merrick Garland now will go ahead and pursue criminal charges or prosecution against Steve Bannon. I know that Garland acknowledged the fact that they're going to follow the law, the text of the law. And, his appointment to that position was even a kind of like a dip to the hat to conservatives. He could have gone with a more liberal choice. I thought he was going to go with Doug Jones. And Doug Jones is moderate, of course, but I'm wondering if you think he's going to actually pursue and go after Steve Bannon the way a lot of progressives want him to.
Wow.
I don't think so. I think I know Judge Garland. I like him, but he's not built to take on this kind of fight. He's too conservative, and the risk of firing up a lawsuit, a litigation against Steve Bannon, criminal prosecution, and losing is more risk than he's willing to take, I think. Because I don't think it's certain that you convict him. I mean, the last time somebody was prosecuted for contempt of Congress, there was an acquittal.
Well, that's a sad story. When you think about what happened on January 6th, it's like, wake up.
Yeah.
I mean, this you're just gonna. I keep thinking about the Supreme. I'm blanking on his name right now. That's terrible. Supreme Court justice who's ready to retire, but he's not going to retire because
Breyer.
Breyer, yeah, he doesn't want it to be political. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Are you kidding? So again, I think I don't know what these people are smoking, man, but
Yeah.
it's a very, very serious, kind of situation. Again, and I think Bob Woodard's book shows, that what Bannon's involvement was with all of this, and you're just going to let that go by because you don't want somebody to call you a dirty name. I mean, come on, man.
Yeah.
Well, Professor Cook, Professor McDougall, I want to thank you for spending my 25th birthday with me. Today is my birthday.
Whoa, hey, happy birthday, young fella. 25? I can't remember back that far.
See, that's what I was saying about young people. Young people, they got this stuff together, man.
Yeah,
got it
that's
together.
great.
It means a lot that we're able to share a lot of your insight and knowledge tonight on this show. Even though it was just three of us, it was one of my favorite episodes and very informative. I want to thank the viewers who faithfully tune in for watching and being a part of the conversation with your comments and everything. Thank you, Mr. Nwangpa, for your happy birthday wishes. So kind. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude episode 49. Episode 49 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, sir.